Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you in our new podcast by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, Planet Profit. Hi, and welcome back to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. In this episode, we turn to lead agronomist for Cornelius Seed, Craig Allaman, and check in on the growing season and discuss what's important for corn and soybeans and the stages of growth they're in. We'll also learn a little about a soil-borne organism favored by excessive soil moisture called Pythium. So let's jump right in. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Juan.
I'm sure we have a variety of stages our corn and soybeans are in right now, Craig, based off when we planted. But in general, what should we be looking for at this stage of the game?
Well, it's a little different for corn and beans because they're definitely different animals, and their growth habit is definitely a lot different, and when and how they determine yield. So we'll start out with corn. We've probably got, depending on planting time frame, we've probably got a lot of corn at that. I'm going to say V4 to V6. It's a pretty good range, but you're seeing a lot of post herbicides go on. With corn, there's kind of a handful of barometers that we really want to look at for yield. The first would be how we merge out of the ground, because if we have slow emergence or if we get hammered with diseases, that's either we'll have some plants that will completely die, or plants that get injured enough that, we may see barren plants or nubbin ears, things like that. So that's kind of the first one. But the second big one is around that V5 growth stage. And V5 means that we have 5 fully developed leaf collars on the plant. And that you include the first true leaf, which is always a rounded on the end, and the rest of the leaves will be pointed to count that stage. But at that V5, it really begins in V4 and it's completed by V6. But we're determining the number of rows around on the ear of that corn plant. So that's a big time frame that I always like to look and see, how is my crop growing? Am I stress free? Do I have plenty of moisture? That's also the time where we want to be careful not to stress it ourselves. Back in the days when we used to use a lot of SU chemistry on corn, like Accent, a Beacon, things like that, we would need to be really careful not to apply during that time frame, because we could stress the plant, and we may put 18 rows around halfway up the ear, and then it would pinch down to 16 because of that stress. But you can also do that. Last year we saw that in Northern Illinois. We had a really intense early summer drought, and I did see years that got pinched down because they were stressed during this growth period. But as I see things, both in the areas I've traveled and the people I've talked to, I think our growth is really good right now. We had rain, we really kind of dried out a little bit, and we're rooting down well. Nice warm conditions, a lot of sun, which is always good. And so I think for corn, this really the second one, as I mentioned, where we're determining number of rows around on that ear, I think we're off to a nice start. So that's what we look at in corn this time of the year. And then on soybeans, as early as the middle of last week, I was seeing some of the beans that were planted the last week in April hitting that V3 growth stage. And what is key about that is, when we started, 3-4 years ago now, we started doing the early planting soybeans. And one of the great benefits of that, or one of the keys to increasing the yield with this program, is that we're flowering earlier. So, in the old days, I say, but previous to the early planted soybeans, we would think about starting to flower that week after the summer solstice, which is June 21st. So now with these earlier planted beans, particularly, not always, but particularly if we get to that V3 growth stage before that week before the summer solstice, then we'll start flowering then. And so you could get a couple of weeks early flowering. What that gives to us is as much as 2 weeks more in the R2 stage then later on. And that's when we're putting nodes on the soybean plant, and we're getting additional nodes by doing that. So again, I've seen I've seen that we've hit that growth stage in a lot of cases, and that's another thing that you can go out and look at in your own field. Am I at that V3 growth stage? And V3 means you're going to have the first 3 trifoliate leaves on that soybean plant are going to be fully extended. None of them are touching each other. That's when you get to the V3 stage. So if you've hit that now, look to be flowering here really any time. I mean, we could start flowering here at the middle of June. If you don't hit that, you could still, if we have some really warm nights at that time period, you could still start flowering and see that happening. But that's really the key to getting that extra, maybe 6-8 bushels that we've been able to get with early planted soybeans, with no additional yield input or no additional input cost into the beans, I might add. So
I'm sure that's wonderful for folks to hear, and especially some of those that may have wished to get out there earlier. And I know we're kind of limited as to when we were, and some of the earlier podcasts we talked about having a compacted growing seasons. It's all good to hear. This morning I was talking to one of our seed reps, is in the southwest Wisconsin area, and he was not quite done putting beans in the ground yet. He was a little bit concerned about just and all this excessive moisture we've had going in. In the last podcast, we covered identifying replant needs and being worried about crusting. For folks that are still putting beans in the ground, what can we tell them to make sure that they're keeping an eye on and to stay on top of it to prevent any yield loss?
Well, if you're still putting beans in the ground this time of the year, I mean, number one, you understand that you're not going to be at those maximum yield potentials. You're just you're penalized a little bit by that late planting, but so we do need to get the beans out of the ground as quickly as possible. And we are having warm, dry conditions. So the most important thing you can do is make sure that you're planting those beans into moisture so that they will germinate and get out of the ground right away. I don't know that there's really any other watch outs other than that. We just need to get them out, get them going. And you still have decent potential at this time of the year. You're just not going to hit that 70, 80 bushel mark like you might with early planted beans.
So is there anything else that you think we need to touch on before we move on to Pythium?
No, I don't think so. On the corn, the next stage at about shoulder high will be the V12 stage, and that's when we determine the length of row. So that's the next time frame on the corn, that I always like to see what's going on as far as the growth to kind of gauge what my potential is there. So we've done rows around right now, roughly knee high, and then we'll do roughly shoulder high. We'll do the length of the row. And then after that, of course, we got to pollinate and fill it out. And so we got a long ways to go. We're off to, I think, a very good start. But we were off to a very good start in areas last year and ended up with some tough issues at the end of the summer. So I guess never comfortable with that yield until we get it into the combine, into the wagons, into the bins. But it seems to be a good start anyway.
Well, that's good. That's definitely good. So, well, then switching gears a little bit over to Pythium, there's a study that was out of the University of Illinois, I believe I saw there, where they touched base on Pythium affecting plants in multiple ways. And, primarily it was rotting seedlings before they emerge and was preventing plants from establishing strong roots or causing death shortly after emergence. And I kind of wanted to, touch base with you on just a general overview of what Pythium is for our listeners, as well as I feel like because we have had some, I think, unseasonably cool weather and had a decent amount of moisture here recently, is it too soon to tell if any of our fields could have been impacted by Pythium damage, or what can we learn from that, and what can you tell us?
Well, the first thing I will say is that Pythium can attack corn or soybeans, so we'll probably talk about both of them a little bit separately.
Okay.
in actuality, this is probably, if you just look at the conditions we have had, and I guess I separate out the earlier planting season when most of the crop went in. Um, this on paper, this should be probably one of the better Pythium years that we've seen. A lot of the planting conditions earlier were not overly wet, not saturated, and not overly cool. Remember, we had the 90-degree temperatures there in early May when a lot of the stuff blew out of the ground. So the quicker it can get out of the ground, the quicker it can get by the Pythium. Now, the Pythium is a water spore. Okay, Rhizoctone is another water spore that we worried about. So instead of like a spore that we think of that is blown by the wind and infects the plants that way, the Pythium is going to come in through the moisture in the soil and infect the plant as a seedling, or the seed itself, or as a seedling, or the roots after the seedling's out of the ground. So that is why we talk about, in general, Pythium is a cool, wet soil condition. It's going to be able to swim in wet soils, so it's going to be able to go to the roots. So it's going to be able to attack them easier. And then cool conditions, it's real prevalent in cool conditions. It's very active, but if you think about it, in cooler, wet conditions, those roots are just going to be sitting there forever, and that seedling even before it emerges. So there's just going to be a longer time period. I say that because last year I mentioned at a meeting, uh, about Pythium being a water spore and prevalent or cool, wet conditions, and then had somebody in the crowd remind me that they had some pretty bad Pythium in northern Iowa where they were awfully droughty. So the lesson there is we need to know that Pythium is always going to be able to attack our seedlings. Unless there is no moisture in the soil at all, in which case we wouldn't have a plant. That plant's going to grow into areas where there's the Pythium spores are going to be, so it can attack us at any time. In 2019, that was an ideal year. If you remember it was just a nightmare on emergence. We were cold and wet for a month. That was probably the biggest Pythium year we've seen in a long time. But again, then last year under dry conditions, we saw it. So it's a disease that we're always going to be dealing with. In corn, it's going to, potentially could kill that seedling when it's just germinating and just emerging, all the way up to just affecting the roots, and just causing the roots to be not as viable as normal, and causing plants. And maybe that's a lot of times where we see a plant that is barren or has a nub and ear because it's been affected by Pythium and it's not as strong as its neighbor that's not affected. So that's on the corn side. And then as you talked earlier, it also affects soybeans. And a lot of times what we'll see on Pythium is soybeans is a dampening off, and a damping off. We see damping off happen under warm, wet conditions a lot of times. It might be in June when we see that, and those soybeans have emerged, and they just, the stem just gets wet and brown and just pinches off basically, and those plants will completely die, and then we have a replant situation. So, Pythium we have to worry about in corn and soybeans. And on the corn side of it, we have introduced into our lineup a new seed treatment called Viantis, which is just a game changer for Pythium control. And that's just part of our package because we operate in a world where Pythium is just prevalent everywhere. So when that came along, we saw the value in it, and we just brought it into the lineup right away because we really think we can save our customers or earn our customers a lot of profit by having that protection on that plant.
Sounds like there is no seed available with resistance to Pythium. I mean, you talked about, in corn that, we're putting Viantis, we're using seed treatment to help protect against it. What about soybeans?
we have not went to the Viantis on the soybeans yet. We're looking at that. Pythium is just not nearly as damaging on the soybean plant as it is on corn. So we need to see if that value is really there. It's really a infrequent damping off type situation that we worry about with Pythium on soybeans. But corn is where we really get hammered and where we really lose yield and lose profitability. So that's really been our focus.
Okay.
One more thing that I might add, Juan, that we saw last year that's a result of Pythium. We saw at the end of the year, we saw a lot of crown rot. And that's something that shows up at the end of August. And when you have a cornfield that's everything's still green, the entire plants are still green, and then every now and then you'll see a plant that's totally dead. It's just completely brown. If you dig that plant up and you split the stalk clear down at the crown, where you have that triangle that's going into the soil, that crown will just be brown and dead. And that's what that's the end result of Pythium or Rhizoctonia, something similar. But a lot of times in our area, it's Pythium that has infected the plant at germination, and that disease is inside that plant the entire year, affecting it. Even if it doesn't kill it, it's no doubt it has reduced the ear size or made a plant that's barren. And at the end of the season, then we see that crown rot that finishes that plant off and then kills it. And we just think, well, it's crown rot. Well, where'd crown rot come from? Well, it started out as Pythium or Rhizoctonia or something similar. But in most cases in our part of the world, it's Pythium, because that's our most prevalent soil-borne fungal disease.
So thank you for circling back on that. We covered that we're putting on seed treatments on corn to help with Pythium. Is there any considerations that we can make when we're planting? I mean, I realize that we're in all varieties of growth stages right now. Like I mentioned earlier, I talked to someone that I wasn't done yet in putting soybeans in the ground. So if we can help anybody out now that is planting into cool and wet soils, what considerations can they make?
Well, eventually there's not going to be any cool wet soils left, just with the calendar.
Okay.
For sure. And if it is cool, it's real briefly. But our soil temps are so good, so high now that it's not a big concern. But what we have learned with it, and we've spent a lot of time, the past year or two talking about, we really need to be more careful with getting out too early with corn than we do with soybeans, because of that penalty we'll have on too early planting with corn. And a lot of that it's the cold wet soils. Now, cold wet soils, we can get imbibitional chilling, we can get just cold injury, but that's also when those cool wet fungal diseases like Pythium really set in. When that seedling sets out there in the ground for 3 weeks or better before it's coming out of the ground, and we have something like Pythium attacking it in the soil, that's when we're going to have problems. And the flip side of that is we don't have as much of a penalty on the front side for planting the early planted soybeans as we do corn. So that's where we've kind of, and I know personally myself, when it's time to go, many times I'll feel like it's too cold to plant corn. The soil moisture is good. And so I'll get out there and I'll plant my beans, knowing I don't have as much of a penalty being on the early side on soybeans. And then when I get my beans done, a lot of times it's pretty good conditions for corn. And that's the way it worked out this year. We planted all our beans. I think we switched over to corn on the 29th of April. We had warmer conditions, and both crops came up real well, so it worked out really good. But I find being able to plant, feeling comfortable planting those beans early, it keeps me out of that corn planter when I shouldn't be in it. So I think it's a nice side benefit.
Well, that's good. I think we've said cool and wet several times throughout this podcast. I mean, important to note that when we talk about cool and wet, I mean, we're talking about ranges of 50 to 59 degrees. Would you agree with that? Or
Yeah, well, we're in great shape as long as our soil at planting depth is 50 degrees or above. I mean, we don't want anything at that point, and going to stay there. It's when we dip down. We dip down into those lower 40s, upper 30s that we really start getting into the danger zone.
okay, good. Well, I think it sounds like overall, um, you've mentioned that things are looking good where we want them to see. Any last minute tips or things to watch out for that as folks are out there scouting fields and checking things out?
I will just reiterate that last year at this time, I thought our crops in Western Illinois here were tremendous, and we got hit with um, southern rust and tar spot and late summer drought, and just absolutely hammered our corn. So we're a long, long ways from the finish line. We are, I believe, off to a good start, but we do need to stay vigilant, just aware of what's going on. Be ready to scout at the end of June, 1st of July for fungus, foliar fungus like gray leaf spot. The tar usually sets in late, so we need to keep an eye on that later than we used to. But a foliar fungicide application last year paid huge dividends. And it's a good percentage of the time it does. At a minimum, be out there scouting if you're not planning on that as a planned program already, and make sure that we don't lose the advantages of this good start to something that's going to nip us in the butt later in the season.
Great. Well, with that, thank you all of you that joined us and checked out our podcast. As Craig mentions, we're going to have some other good and timely podcasts as the season progresses. So don't forget to subscribe. And if anything comes up, if you have any questions about what we talked about, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And you can do that by going to our website or visiting any of our local salesmen. Thank you.